Okay, everyone. Thanks for coming out to the webinar today. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. I know for many of you that currently operate short-term rentals, it's not the kind of type of situation that we'd like to be meeting to discuss. Hopefully, a lot of our clients are real estate investors and wanting to buy more properties, not talk about how you need to be handling and dealing with the government swinging the ban hammer and making your life a lot more difficult. But such is life. This is the way things are. And I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of going through the process, understanding exactly what the legislation means, how it affects you, some of the potential workarounds and solutions that you may have. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the financing options that you might have to get around this, especially if you do have a legal short-term rental. So let's get right into it. Thanks for coming to our webinar. Obviously the dream is to have a wonderful, beautiful short-term rental, something you get to rent out on a frequent basis, make a lot of money. And of course, in general, the idea or the dream is that it should be easy money, right? Obviously with these new rules, not so fast. It's obviously becoming a lot more difficult. And even in the past, depending on which market you're in, some of the short-term rental markets have been suffering and haven't had as much cash flow as people expected. But definitely the government coming in and swinging the hammer and making a lot of sweeping changes is definitely affecting things. First, BC mentioned that they're going to bring in some new rules to create more housing. Just last week, the short bill is staying intact. It passes without any amendments, which was interesting to see. And that moved very, very quickly, by the way. And now we're even starting to hear that on a federal level, now that BC is announcing crackdown, now all of a sudden the federal government is starting to wonder, maybe we should be looking at doing something as well. Just recently, I think it was yesterday or even today, we're hearing that New Brunswick is starting to consider this. I don't think that it's a surprise that the BC is perhaps first to launch this in Canada, but may not be the last. And I think that's really important for those of you. And I noticed some people in the chat, like Leo, for instance, is mentioning, hey, maybe I should be looking at doing something in Alberta. What are the thoughts on that? I think it's risky, in my opinion, to be setting up something expecting the short-term rental market to still be a thing. And I do think that certain provinces may be less likely or more likely to enact this. Alberta is probably not as high on the list as somewhere like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, perhaps Ontario is probably the big one. However, when you start to see this, sometimes it's just the first domino to fall, and all of a sudden you see all the other dominoes fall after that. So something that I think we all need to be very, very aware of and think about here is that, yes, Canada or the British Columbia is the first one to do this, but I'm not so sure it's going to be the last one in Canada to do this. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's happening. I want to get into the core details so that everybody understands, as there's a lot of information going around. And for many of you that already own a short-term rental, you may already know all of this information, but I do want to go over the high-level details of what exactly the legislation is. It's effectively saying that short-term rentals are being banned, and the fines are increasing from $2,000 maximum to $50,000 maximum. And one of the most important key items here that they're clarifying is that they're removing non-conforming grandfathering. So what ends up happening a lot of the time is if a property has been used in a certain way for a long period of time, it may be what's called non-conforming, but legal. And what that means is that non-conforming says, well, the zoning has since changed, or the bylaws have since changed, and we actually want the property to be used in this manner, not that manner. However, we're going to grandfather the use because the use was already pre-existing before these rules have changed. And so that's something that is really important to keep in mind and think about. The biggest challenge here, I think, and this is probably going to be the biggest legal battle that will come up through this, is that many people have made a buying decision based off of non-conforming grandfathering rules. And so I think this is going to be a big issue, and I have a feeling that there may be some potentially some class action lawsuits to go after this specific item and try to be able to manage that. And ideally, I think that's probably the grounds on which many people will be trying to fight. I think is trying to say, well, look, I've made a buying decision based off of it being non-conforming, but I was being grandfathered. And so this is the real like high level core. Now, I think what's really important is we need to understand the definition of a short-term rental. And so the government is saying that anything offered on short-term rental platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera, would be considered this. They've also mentioned that it doesn't have to be on these platforms. You can be posting it on something like Craigslist. And keep in mind the language that they're using. And you can definitely search up and go to the BC government website to learn more about this and really read the details. But they're really trying to go wide with this. They're not just saying that if it's on a short-term rental platform, you can't do it. They're also trying to say that, hey, if you're listing it even on Craigslist as a vacation rental, that's also considered a short-term rental. Here's a very important distinction. So previously, for instance, in Vancouver, not too long ago, they had changed the rules and moved it and said anything less than 30 days is considered short-term. Anything longer than 30 days is considered long-term, or at least wasn't considered short-term. And that classification meant that certain number of short-term rental individuals in Vancouver said, well, okay, what I'll do is I'll just rent out my property to people that are renting it for at least 30 days. And it allows people to still capture a bit of that midterm, that corporate rental customer. You still had some vacation individuals or people that needed medium-term stays. But at the end of the day, 90 days is a much more drastic move. It's literally tripling with a definition of how many days it is that determines whether it's short-term or not. And so that's a very important distinction to think about and understand. And one of the things that they're going after here is just anything that's considered generally tourist accommodations. That would be the definition of a short-term rental. Now, there are some exemptions, and we should talk about this and really understand and hone in on what some of these exemptions mean. So first of all, probably the biggest one here is that the host's residence plus one secondary suite or an accessory dwelling is allowed. And so if you're renting out a portion of your home or a suite in your own home, then that is okay. That is exempt. And this is going to be something that they'll continue to allow moving forward. This seems to be a very common rule. And so it really is meaning that everybody has a single unit condo in a building somewhere. Those people are the ones that are getting hammered with this. But if you're renting out a portion of your own home, then a short-term rental would be exempt in this case. Now, also, less than 10,000 population, the municipality does not need to be in it, but the municipality can decide to opt into it. And the recommendation offered by the BC government to these smaller municipalities is they're saying, well, tell you what, if your vacancy is quite high, then maybe you don't want to be discouraging people from using properties as short-term rentals. However, you can still opt in if you choose to. And so this is going to be something that's going to be very interesting to see. I'm not really sure how many small communities will be opting into it, but they do have the choice to do it. Now, I won't go into what the 14 resort municipalities are. You can search and find those online, but you're going to find places like Whistler, Fernie, Kimberley. Basically, one of the things that they really tried to isolate is anything that is considered a ski resort or a mountain resort type of town. So mountain resort areas. Interestingly, something called the Island Trust. So that would encompass all of the Gulf Islands between Vancouver Island and the mainland there. So the Islands Trust is something that that is exempt from this. However, and I know this because I was looking at buying a short-term rental or a cabin or dwelling for ourselves for personal use, my wife and I, and we had heard that the Island Trust, although they didn't really have an official rule on this, there's a lot of pressure to go with you can rent out your residence or a secondary dwelling in your residence, which points us right back to point number 1 here on the slide. So just be careful of that if you're expecting to buy something in the Gulf Islands, that maybe the Gulf Islands, i.e. the Islands Trust, may still adopt that. Now, here's an interesting one, and I'm very curious to see what happens here. Agritourism. So if you own property in Kelowna or on the Naramata Bench or in Penticton or very close to wineries, could that be considered agritourism? And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important here as we dive into it is to understand clearly the exemptions, understand clearly the definitions. And I think that what we're really going to have to do is really legally get into things here. Understand what is considered agritourism. Perhaps there's a definition on the website. I haven't gone through that myself yet, to be honest. But perhaps, especially if you own a short-term rental in an area with a winery very close by, perhaps you can go with the agritourism approach, and perhaps you'd be exempt in that case. So that's something to look into. But high level, out of those 14 resort municipalities, almost all of them are all ski towns. So mountain resort areas is something that you could see. Interestingly, I did not see Sun Peaks on the list, and Sun Peaks is very large. However, I do think that although Sun Peak is not on the list, I wonder if they fall underneath the mountain resort areas classification, because Sun Peaks is quite a large ski town. I did see something very quickly in the chat asking about Penticton. I did not see Penticton on the list, but Osoyoos is on the list, which I thought was interesting because Penticton and Osoyoos are relatively similar. But yes, Osoyoos is on the list. Penticton is not on the list. Here's another interesting classification: hotels and motels, and likely timeshares and fishing lodges and things like that. So hotels and motels is a really important distinction here, and something that I think that we need to investigate further to understand. As an example, a hotel and a motel in, let's say, Whistler. There are a lot of condo hotels in Whistler, and those would be considered hotels. Now, I'm wondering, what is the requirement to be considered a hotel or a motel? And so I think there might be some avenues, depending on the property that you're in, to perhaps go down that path and consider yourself a hotel. There are what we call condo hotels in maybe major urban centers. And in general, I find that as a mortgage broker, those are harder to finance. But you may find now that all of a sudden these properties, because they have a hotel designation, may be exempt from the short-term rental ban and may actually be a better investment moving forward, because it might be one of the only properties that is able to legally rent itself out short-term. Another important one is native leasehold land is also exempt. So any native lands would be considered exempt from this list as well. So so these are the primary exemptions that we can see on the list. And Laurie, on La Casa and Kelowna, I do not know that, but I know that Kelowna is not listed. I do not believe that an area like Fintry would be listed. So that I believe falls outside of the jurisdiction of what is allowed, and so that's something that we'd have to look into for sure. Now, as far as timelines are concerned, first of all, I had to search this up. What is royal assent? So royal assent is when all legislative parties and levels of parliament have agreed to the bill passing. So it's not just provincial, but it's or it's not just the lowest level legislation passing it, but all levels of legislation passing it, and that means that it's falling under the royal assent. After royal assent, it means that increased fines and business licensing requirements, etc. And so you can expect that increase to the fines and business licensing may be coming fairly soon, especially with the business licensing aspect. I think that they're going to be trying to roll that out as quickly as possible. Now, on May 1st, this is when the principal residence requirement will be kicking in and changes to non-conforming use protections. So if you've been operating currently underneath a non-conforming use protection, then this is where the principal residence requirement would allow you to continue to operate as such if you are doing so. However, if it's a single rental property and you do not live there and you're hoping to operate as a non-conforming use, as of May 1st, that will be no longer allowed. The next step is that in summer 2024, they're expecting data sharing to be occurring with Airbnb, VRBO. So basically what the government's going to be doing is saying, hey, all of you platforms, we require you to report and give us a list of all the properties that are listed. And then guess what? In late 2024, there'll be a provincial registry launch and requiring all the platforms to remove unauthorized listings. So effectively what they're going to be doing is grabbing the information from these short-term rental platforms, comparing it to their list of all of the authorized listings and all the people that have the appropriate business license, and then removing all of those that do not. It's not here on the timeline, but one of the other things that they're doing is ensuring that when you have your listing, you have to have your approved business license on your listing in order to be approved. And this is really where they're going to be trying to collect and get all that data sharing, and then making sure that that they're enforcing it. And this is going to be the way that they're going to enforce it. So the question is, why is the government doing this? It really is affecting a lot of individuals and a lot of people. There's a couple of reasons, and from the government's perspective, there's a couple of pros. They're obtaining and hoping to create more housing for long-term rentals. I think that the estimate that I saw was there's approximately 16,000 units. I can't remember if that's the total or the number of units that they think would be returned to long-term rentals. And so they're expecting or hoping that a number of units will start to flood the market, and that would hopefully bring down rental rates for a period of time anyways. And they're also establishing a provincial regulation. So as of right now, it's all municipal level, but it's really hard for all these small municipalities to be able to enforce it. And so the province is saying, well, let us take care of it. We're larger, we're at scale. We can create a provincial regulation and create these policies and whatnot to run this. And it makes it a lot easier for some of those small municipalities who just don't have a person that they can allocate to chasing down all of the illegal short-term rentals in any market. So that's what they're viewing as the pro here. And obviously, some of the cons, again, from the government perspective, I'm sure that they understand that this is going to decrease options to stay, reducing tourism. I know that when I talk to other people about this and ask, well, how do you travel? When you're going to travel to a new place, do you stay in a hotel? Do you stay in an Airbnb? And a lot of people say, I prefer to stay somewhere where I have my own kitchen. I have my own laundry. I have the necessary needs that I need in order to be feeling like I'm living in a place, not just staying in it. It's cheaper to stay in an Airbnb, not just because of the accommodation cost, but it's also cheaper because I'm not having to go out and eat in the restaurant every single day. I can actually go to the local market and shop in the local areas and do that and really get the full experience. And I think that this is a potential backswing effect. It's going to have a huge impact. And thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's definitely going to affect FIFA 2026. Absolutely. This is going to be a major issue. Imagine what the cost of hotel rates are going to be in 2026 for FIFA. It's going to be absolutely insane. And I think that's another downside effect here. If you're reducing all of the supply, you're going to have a drastically larger hotel rate, which is going to curb a lot of people from wanting to visit British Columbia. And so tourism is going to take a bit of a hit. Now, that being said, I don't want to scare everybody too much, because the reality is tweaks will be made to this. It's very rare for a government to release some kind of legislation and say, this is the legislation, take it or leave it. We're not going to change anything. We're not going to make any amendments to this. In general, they come up with legislation and then they find out, oh, there's a couple of loopholes. There's an unintended consequence of this. We're going to tweak this and we're going to tweak that. And so there's going to be different things. And it's really important that you have a voice in this situation. You need to make sure that you keep up the good fight. And there's a lot of different options to get involved. And I'll get into that in a moment. Now, if you're asking me for my crystal ball and what's going to happen, I think a couple of things are going to happen. First of all, I think it's no doubt that you're going to see an increase in supply in the unauthorized locations. We're definitely going to see those areas. There's certain markets. Victoria is one that pops out to me. And I know Victoria inside and out because I personally, my wife and I, we own a 7-unit building in downtown Victoria. And guess what? We're using it for short-term rentals as well. So very well versed in what's happening and trying to do as much research as possible to see how it's going to affect us. But you're definitely going to see an increase in supply in these unauthorized locations. Now, what happens if you see an increase in supply in markets? Generally means that you're going to have lower prices. And I think that this is the argument that a lot of people have, is they say, I made a buying decision to buy this property based off of a legal non-conforming use, and you're taking away that property right from me, and now my property value has decreased. And I think that's the major crux of the issue. If people knew that this rule was going to come out in a couple of years, then they would have said, okay, well, I'm going to make an adjustment. Maybe I'll wait and I'll sell it at an opportune time, or maybe I will change my opinion and maybe I will not buy something. But instead, they've come down and given people very little time. The market is obviously quieter and slower because of interest rates being so high, and it's pigeonholing a lot of people. And I've heard a lot of stories. Recently I heard of a story of a woman who she sold all of her investments for retirement, and she bought 4 properties in Victoria, in the downtown area, expecting that to be her retirement fund. And can you imagine if all 4 of those units sell for a loss? This poor lady could be losing, $100,000, $200,000 in equity just by buying and then selling them very shortly after. So, there are some definite issues there. And I think what will also happen is you're going to see a lot of these get moved over from short-term to long-term. And so you're going to see that the long-term rents, I believe, in certain areas, depending on the supply and demand and whatnot, you're either going to see that the prices flatten out and at least stop increasing, or you may see that the long-term rents even decrease. And that's another concern, is that if you're sitting on something that's a short-term rental, if you and many other people are turning them into long-term rentals, when now again the supply is growing and the demand will be about the same as it was last month, right? So the issue now is that I think for the short term, you'll see long-term rents decrease. And I still think that the problem is the government is trying to patch this up, and they're trying to solve the housing issue by increasing the supply, by getting a lot of short-term rentals off the market. But I think the core issue here is not necessarily the short-term rentals. I think it's a very small amount of the supply here in BC. I think that the issue here is really that they have not been able to get a hold of how to get every municipality to increase supply in those markets. And that's the real crux of the issue. So all this is happening. There's a lot of things to look at. And I think that it's important to just take a step back, and we can complain and moan all we want. But at the end of the day, we have to start taking some action. We need to start to look into what are the things that you can influence in this. And I will say this, I've seen government rules come by, especially in the mortgage industry. They seem to give us new rules every 6 or 12 months. I think that the reality here is that this bill is going to pass in some shape or form. And so it's not realistic for you to sit on your hands and just assume, oh, it's all going to blow over. I'm pretty sure it's not going to blow over, unfortunately. But I think it's important to figure out, okay, what are your options, and start to take some action. So a couple of the things to look into. How could your property be defined as a hotel? And in some cases, it's just not possible. But if hotels are exempt from this, then what is the definition of a hotel in your municipality? How do you define yourself as a hotel? Because hotels and motels are exempt. So can you determine what the municipality's definition of a hotel is? And can you create an argument and story that your hotel or motel is exempt? And of course, there's other reasons, another spinoff here. Are you exempt if it's native leased land, or maybe agritourism, or other reasons? So really trying to dive into all of the micro reasons in which, look at every single exemption. How can you make a case for why your property would be exempt? Another thing, obviously, is converting your property to medium or to long-term. One of the things that you're going to find is that when you're trying to convert to medium term, there's going to be a lot of supply in certain markets where a lot of people are going to think the same thing. It really depends on your property. So for instance, in our property in Victoria, does not have underground parking right underneath it. It's not as much of an issue for short term when people are visiting and taking the ferry to get there, or flying in or whatnot. But it is more of an issue with medium term tenants, people that are going to stay there for 6 months or 7 months. In general, people like to have parking underground. And so you have to look at your property type. Is it suitable for medium term? And the reality is, I know that those property managers are getting a lot of calls right now on, hey, can I rent out my property medium term? Can I rent out my property medium term? We're going to talk about this a lot, but supply and demand. The demand's not increasing a whole lot for corporate travel and other travel reasons. If the supply increases substantially, it's going to lower prices, and you may not be getting much more than you would if you just converted it to long term. My concern, of course, if you convert it to long term and the long term rental rates are starting to decrease, then you may find that you end up putting a long term tenant into your property at a lower price today because of the depressed rent prices because of too much supply. And then, of course, our lovely government in BC does not allow you to increase the rents very much every year. So it's usually an inflation adjusted number. And for some reason, they don't acknowledge the inflation number has been 5-7% for the last couple of years. They're allowing us to increase the rents by 1 or 2% per year, not 5%. So, so they're always adjusting that number down and bringing it to significantly lower than the amount that of the actual inflation. So it always seems to be an inflation adjusted number, but always underneath what the headline CPI inflation numbers are. Another thing that you may want to consider is what are the exemptions, and then can you get rezoning on the property? If you can get it zoned to be a bed and breakfast, as an example, or a hotel or whatnot, maybe there's an opportunity here, depending on where your property is, and if it's in a zone where you could get it rezoned, maybe a rezoning process could be an option for you. Really important too, while we're doing this, reach out to your local MP, reach out to news outlets, reach out to media. The more noise that everybody makes on this, the more pressure there will be to find a solution. Because the problem is the noisy people have been the people that have been saying, I can't afford to live in X city. And so that noisy group of people is causing the BC government to say, okay, we need to listen to our voters and we need to propose options. And so short-term rental owners also need to be noisy and say, well, hold on here. This is not reasonable. This is not fair. Let's find something that's fair. Also, there's other groups like the Property Rights of British Columbia. There's a lot of people that are I'm not going to say becoming activists, because that's not the word I'm looking for here, but a lot of people are taking action and finding ways of getting people together, creating power in the size of these groups, power in numbers. And I'm sure that there's even some lawyers that are saying, hey, you know what? If there's enough people that are interested, we can take on this case. There's going to be a lot of that going on in the next little while. And so look out. There's a lot of different Facebook groups, et cetera, that you can find where you can find more information about this, and just try to be as involved as you can. Now, there are some financing options here depending on the situation. And so it's good to understand what you can do and what your options are. The reality is there's financing challenges with renting out short-term rentals. And so I do want to address what the issues are with dealing with short-term rentals. And one of the issues from a bank's perspective, which bucket is an Airbnb in? When I say that, when a lender's lending to somebody and it's a residential property, but it's rented out short-term, is the loan supposed to be based off of it being a residential property when really it doesn't have a long-term tenant in it paying consistent income? It's really more of a hotel. But hotel financing is very different than residential lending to banks. And so the problem that banks have really had and struggled with is, which bucket do I put this property into? There's one major bank that recently came out with some short-term rental guidelines and policies where they said, well, there are some ways that they can recognize short-term rental income. And there's been a number of what we call B lenders that have also come out and said, hey, we do have some programs and policies that will recognize this income. But in general, with most banks, it is hard to get banks to use it on the property that you're financing. So that is one of the issue. And especially if you're buying a property that's never been short-term rented before, what is the income? Banks don't like to use projected income on properties. They like to use reliable, stable income in order to be able to use a number. And that's usually they like to use unfurnished one-year tenancies to use it. And that goes back to the fact you don't have a lease, you don't have consistent bank deposits, you don't have any consistency with the income, and that's something that they don't like to see. Now, interestingly, if you already own a short-term rental in your portfolio, they will use whatever rental income, or many banks, I should say, will use whatever rental income is on your T1 generals. That's your tax returns. And so they'll look at the gross income on the tax return and divide that number by 12 and then use that. Interestingly, because they're not using the expenses too in many cases, that gross income ends up being a lot more income to help you qualify for future mortgages and other debt. But it's very difficult for you to finance that specific property. But if it's not the property you're financing and you have a short-term rental in your portfolio, sometimes it can actually generate a situation where you actually can qualify and you have more income to use, not less income. And refinancing a vacation rental, as an example, is where it's very difficult because trying to finance the property itself when it is a short-term rental, banks generally tend to shy away from it. So see, these are some of the challenges that you run into when you're trying to finance a short-term rental. Now, if you were to convert this to a long-term rental, then you could get better financing. And so there may be a few of you out there that have been having difficulties getting financing because it is a short-term rental. And this might force you to say, well, what would my mortgage payments be if I restructured my debt, amortized it over 30 years, got a specific mortgage rate on it? What would my cost be? And then what would my rental income be? And then compare those two together and try to figure out, what would the numbers be? What would my rental loss be every month? Would it be earning income? Would it be losing money, et cetera? And so this is something where you want to really dive into it and understand it as much as possible. Now, there are some options if you are legally allowed to operate. And I should preface this by saying that some lenders, or I should say none of the lenders, have addressed this new concern. I don't know if lenders are going to say, well, now that this has happened in BC, maybe they're going to start to pull these programs off. But it's too bad because a bunch of lenders had recently come up with new programs on how to finance these. There are some lenders that offer up to 70 or 75% financing. They're lending based off of the income of the property as a short-term rental. So they're actually addressing and using the short-term rental income, not just what it would rent out for if it was a long-term tenancy, which is the way that many other banks would treat this. Now, in general, a lot of these lenders are B lenders. There is one bank that will consider it, but most of them are B lenders, and usually the rates are much higher. So you can expect rates to be somewhere around 8.99%, which is not a lot better than private lending. And usually there's fees of 1 or 2% of the loan amount, but they sometimes can go up to a 40-year amortization, which at least means that the cash flow may not be that different than getting a bank mortgage on the property. There's also another option here, which is commercial lending. So I won't go into too much detail about it, but the reality with commercial lending is that they look at the income and the expenses, and they want the income to be 1.25 times all of the expenses. And so when they're determining how much you could qualify for, if you have a couple of years of financials history, and you can show that to the bank and you can get a commercial loan on it, you may be able to actually refinance and pull out some equity or get debt on it if you can fit the commercial guidelines and details. And the interesting thing in the commercial side is that the way that they look at the debt servicing is they look at their income. They prefer leases and sometimes can use market rents, but sometimes they can use the financials and the rent roll of existing properties. And so if you do have financials for a short-term rental for the last couple of years, you may be able to use that with a lender underneath the commercial banner or small business lending banner. Another thing is if you have another company that generates income, they could use that company as what's called a corporate guarantee. So kind of like when a kid is buying their first home and gets the parents to guarantee the mortgage and co-sign. You can also do this in business lending, where you can have the business purchase the asset, and you can have another business provide a corporate guarantee, another business that is showing positive cash flow. So there are some options on that side too. Now, there are some tools that we've developed to also help you. I know that this is a lot of information, and to be completely frank, we're all still learning. It's very early in this process. And so the idea here is that everyone, it's really helpful to have everyone come together, ask a lot of questions, share all this information amongst each other, try to make sure that we all know the different mediums and which areas are doing what and who we can reach out to. If you are looking for some help on the mortgage side of things, or if you are wanting to do some analysis on your properties, we do have a short-term rental Airbnb analysis spreadsheet. We also do have long-term rental worksheets as well. So if you're not sure if your property will cash flow and what your return on investment would be if you converted it to long-term rental, then please reach out to us and we'll send you that spreadsheet so you can do a quick analysis to see, well, what if I converted it to a long-term rental? What would my monthly cash flow be, and what would my return on investment be to own it? Because now you need to make an investment decision on whether it makes sense to keep that asset as a long-term asset, or if it makes sense for you to instead sell it off, even if it's at a loss, and then take that money and then reinvest it to something else. Would your return on investment be better or worse if you were to sell it and move that money into something else? So that's where I have tools and spreadsheets that would help you with making that decision. And this is just an example of what one of our spreadsheets looks like. Last but not least, we've created some new software as well that allows us to easily underwrite and assess somebody's financial options without having to collect documents or a credit bureau. This is more of a dip your toes in the water before you jump in head first kind of thing. So Atlas is the program that I've designed, and it actually allows us to underwrite for over 32 lenders all at the same time. And all you're needing to do is fill in either an online form, or if you prefer, you can get us to email you a spreadsheet. You can fill in that spreadsheet, send it back to us, and then within about a day, we can get back to you and say, yeah, based on these inputs, it looks like your options would be this. And so we can give you a high-level idea of whether we think that you might be able to restructure your debt or qualify for a purchase or whatever it is, without you having to commit to sending over all your documents to your broker or bank, and without having to have your credit pull. So it's a very cool tool that we've been working on for quite some time. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, this is our contact information. What I'll do is I'll start to go through the Q&A here. I know there's a ton of messages in the chat, so if we can, maybe I'll get back to that in a little bit here. But if you do have any questions, so let's go into the Q&A. And I really love how the community here is just sharing a lot of different ideas and thoughts, and sharing different spots to collaborate here, because I think, you know, it helps if everybody can kind of get together and start to learn from each other and connect. So Melissa has a couple of questions. So first, is there any other places in the world that have experienced similar legislative restrictions? How did they navigate? How can we learn from them? I think there have been a bunch recently, like New York City, for instance, or maybe it's New York State. New York has released this, and a few other places have as well. Oh, thank you, and Hawaii as well. Interesting that Hawaii. I always find that weird because so many people would stay in a short-term rental in Hawaii. So, so there's a couple of areas, but I think these are still relatively new. I'm not sure about Hawaii, but I know New York is very new. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of it, but I think it's a bit early still to see this. And thank you, Liza. So changes in Europe. So maybe what we need to do, I'm not surprised that Europe would be ahead of the curve on this a little bit. Maybe what we need to do is try to see which European cities have already come up with this ahead of time, and see if perhaps there are options or guidance that we can learn from there. So the answer is I don't know which cities specifically, but I'm sure that it's not that difficult to find out. So what are others doing about compliance? I understand the new business license is $2,500 for the year starting in January. And just to clarify, I think that is in Victoria. Not every city is going to be charging that amount. But I know that in Victoria that is the number. I don't know if BC has come out and said if they're going to have a blanket $2,500 or not, but I know that that's the Victoria cost anyways. So are people buying these given they'll be null in May? A very good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. And it's something that personally I've also reached out to the city of Victoria to find out, because if we're unable to continue to operate after May 1st, I don't really want to be paying $2,500 per unit to be operating for a third of the year. So I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that. I would hope that the cities would be reasonable and fair about that, but hard to say. Next, best practices or step-by-step advice for transitioning to long-term rentals. Well, good question here. So I think the tough part is it would be nice if you could find a tenant who would be interested in renting out your place fully furnished, because your place is probably already furnished. And so if you can find a tenant that's willing to pay the premium, otherwise you have to either sell the furniture at probably a loss and deal with it all. And dealing with all the furniture is going to be another headache all on its own. Or you have to take the furniture out and then store it and then pay for storage while you rent it out unfurnished, and you're getting unfurnished rates. I think in a perfect world, you'd probably want to try to advertise your place as a furnished area or furnished property and see if that would work. And frankly, you're going to have to get all over the place. You're going to need to make sure that you're on every listing. I do have some concerns. There's going to be a lot of people looking at renting their place out fully furnished and for long-term tenancies. And so there might be a bit of a glut depending on where your property is located. Martha asks, how about resort communities like Parksville, Qualicum Beach? I don't remember if they were on the list. I'd have to double check that. But you can check that, and you can go to find the resource here. I think actually what I'll do is I'll just post the link to all the information in the chat here. So you can find all of it, and then I'll see if they have it listed really quickly. Just find if I can see where they listed it here on the website. I know they had a list of the 14 areas that are exempt. Let's see here. Yeah, 14 resorts. Okay, so City of Fernie, Golden, Harrison Hot Springs, Invermere, Kimberly, Osoyoos, Radium Hot Springs, Revelstoke, Rossland. Oh, Sun Peaks is listed here. Somebody said that Sun Peaks wasn't, so I'm not sure. It seems like it is. District of Tofino, Ucluelet, Valemount, and Whistler. So those are the areas that are listed there. Interestingly, Parksville is not one of them. Next question, which bank is the one that is considering short-term rental income? Well, you have to call me. No, I'm just joking. I've heard that it's BMO that's doing it. So if you do need to contact a BMO, just reach out to me and I'm happy to share that. I don't know all the details. I've been needing to reach out to my BMO contact and just clarify exactly how they're underwriting it and assessing it, but I have not been given a clear indication as of now on exactly how they're underwriting it. And then all of this is blowing up. And so it might be a moot point anyways. I have a feeling that as a bank, I probably wouldn't want to be lending on something where people are not going to be able to use this income in the future. So it might be all for naught anyways. Barney has a question. Hey, Barney. Will a primary residence basement suite be considered a secondary suite exemption? This is not allowed for short-term rental at the moment. My understanding is that it would be exempt. And so my understanding is that a primary residence, they said that a basement suite or a accessory dwelling would be exempt from these new rules. So my understanding is that would be exempt, and you'd be able to do that. Perry asks, what if I only operate short-term rental for 2 to 4 months per year, then go longer rental rest of the year? I'm pretty sure that that would not qualify, Perry. So I do not think that you'd be able to do that. If you live in the property and it's considered your primary residence, then you may be able to operate and rent it out as a short-term rental while you're not there. But there's no current ability to only rent it out as a short-term for short periods of time. Of course, if you rented it out for 90 days at a time, then maybe that's a way of getting around it. So how do you find people that are willing to rent your place out for 3 months or more would be the question for you. James, do you have any leads on which legal firm may be involved in class action or judicial review? I think I've seen a couple come across my desk. I can't tell you at the moment. I don't have that in front of me. But if you send me an email, then I can probably see if I can find that tomorrow, James. So feel free to send me a note. Monica asks, what are the options for unauthorized suites that are currently short-term rentals? My understanding is that they will be allowed, and you can continue to operate in that manner. So I think you're going to be okay. And then Karen asks, if not on the list, but under 10,000 population, safe to assume we were okay. So yes, although the municipality itself can decide to opt in. And so that's the consideration there, is that the municipality still may make the decision. So I would be careful to maybe reach out to my municipality and figure out, hey, what's your feeling on this? Are you guys planning on doing this or not doing this? And just make sure that you have a good understanding of that, because that could change. Hey, Shannon. Coming in late, so please ignore if I already discussed. We mentioned at Earls the other day something about multifamily and 50-year amortization. What was the deal there? So I was mentioning that you get CMHC insured multifamily financing, and that's for long-term rentals, so not short-term rentals, but long-term rentals for multi-property financing. So 5 or more units is considered multifamily. If you're going to operate and rent it out for long-term tenancies, there's a number of different criteria that if you fit, you can get up to a 50-year amortization, up to 95% loan to cost financing if you're building. It's very difficult to get that kind of financing, especially in BC, just because the rents don't cover the expenses if you borrow that much, especially with today's interest rates. But you can get that on multifamily financing. Next, Danielle is asking, so going forward in May, will everyone with an Airbnb within the exemption list require a business ID? That is my understanding. So I still think that you're going to need to be registered with the registry, and they're going to be following up and ensuring that you're on the registry and conversing with the short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and VRBO to make sure everybody is listed on the platform does have the appropriate license to match. That's what we're expecting. Sandra asks, what documents are used for medium-term rentals? This, I assume, would not fall under the Landlord Tenants Act. Good question. I think that really depends on the nature of the stay. The issue is, I think that because somebody might be living there for 3 months, I think you have to be very careful with what constitutes a tenancy. There's a lot of rules that revolve around what constitutes a tenancy, because if you get somebody that lives there and then stays there for an extended period of time, then that could be a concern. I would probably talk to some of the companies that do corporate rentals. I'm sure that they have leases and agreements, but I have seen some situations where I remember reading up that an individual was renting out properties using these types of agreements, these lease agreements for medium-term rentals, and the government said, no, these are actual tenancies. You should have been using these tenancy agreements and fallen under the Residential Tenancy Act. And it was a bit more than a wrist slapping in that case. So I think it's very important that you figure out and talk to the Residential Tenancy Board about what exactly constitutes medium term, how is the lease structured, and how to protect yourself. This is something that you need to be very careful of, because if you get stuck with a tenant and they fall under the Residential Tenancy Act instead of falling underneath a vacation rental agreement, then that's an issue. I know that when we were creating our own, because to stay at our place at Waddington Flats in Victoria, you could book online direct booking through our website, and then you'd be signing a lease. And we made sure to use the language that is a vacation rental. And that seemed like if it's a vacation rental specifically, then it would not fall under the Residential Tenancy Act. But I wonder if it's a medium term and it's a corporate lease, there might be some muddy waters there. So very important to figure that out. Eva Deng, nice to see you. Can municipalities in Vancouver further restrict, in particular, the ability to short-term rent a secondary suite on the property of your principal residence? So the understanding that I have is that the answer would be no. Well, I guess I should say this. It's hard to know which rules will override now, because if you're specifically asking about Vancouver's short-term rentals policy was that it was 30 days, not 90. And so now I'm wondering at which point, like, which rules will supersede each other. But I'm expecting anyways that the provincial government's coming in and saying, hey guys, get out of our way, let us do this, and we're going to do it one way, and then the municipalities can opt in. But I also am very curious to see, because municipalities are still going to be given certain rights to run it the way that they want. So I think that's something you're going to have to just wait and see what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to have an answer for a while. Arash is asking, given the government recently removing any rental restrictions for 30 days or more, wouldn't that contradict with the 90-day definition of short-term rental? What would be the verdict on 1 to 3 month rentals? So my understanding then is that anything under 90 days is considered short-term rental. And then in order to be able to short-term rent the property, you would need to be exempt from being able to do so, or exempt from the ban. So my understanding is that this new 90-day rule will supersede the previous understanding of 30 days. However, if Vancouver says, no, we want 30 days, I'm very curious to see which government regulation would supersede. Like in general, and I'm not huge into the exact understanding of how the politics works in these cases, but my general knowledge is that usually federal supersedes provincial, supersedes municipal. So my feeling is that the 90 days will supersede any 30-day feeling on the municipal level, but I don't know the answer for sure. Hey, Christian, if you're doing Airbnb in your principal residence, do I need to register the business license? Yes, you will need to have a business license to be able to do that, and they will be following up and ensuring that you have the business license, is my understanding. And then Mark, any input on Kelowna for properties originally designated for ST or like Aqua and Caban? Sorry, I also joined late in case you discussed already. I heard the municipality can ask the province for an exemption if lobbied successfully. That's also what I've heard as well. It's hard to say. Here's what I'm expecting will happen. I think that what the city will do is the city will grant the building the appropriate zoning to probably be called a hotel, and then it will be exempt, is my feeling. If the city is in agreement with what the province or with what the developer is trying to do. If the city feels like that property should exist, then I expect the workaround here is they just say, well, let's just change the zoning to permit hotel use. We'll call this a hotel condo, and now all of a sudden that's allowed. Alejandro, hi there. I would assume you can still start a tenancy for less than 90 days on a fixed term under the regulation 13.1. I would assume as well, if it's considered something that falls under the residential tenancy board regulation. So if you're entering into a residential tenancy that is less than 3 months, I expect that you would still be able to do so. But again, I think that's something that we'll probably find out in due time. I don't think the government has that quite figured out yet. Can you get a business license for unauthorized secondary suites? I'm assuming not. I actually think that you may be able to do that. I don't think that the government will necessarily say that you cannot, but that is also to be determined, because a lot of municipalities, they know that a lot of these units are unauthorized and they still allow long-term tenancies, but it'd be interesting to see if all of a sudden trying to apply for a business license, if all of a sudden they're going to move the needle. And I wouldn't be surprised if they say that you can't if it's unauthorized. So Alejandro says, according to section 13.1 of the regulations, a landlord may include a term for the tenant to vacate at the end of the term if the landlord is an individual and the landlord is a close family member in good faith at the time of entering the agreement to occupy the rental at the end of the term. Oh, so you're talking about being able to get into a property yourself and have the tenant leave in less than 3 months. I mean, the reality is, I think by the time the tenant gets in there and moves in, and then you exercise that option, it's been probably 3 months or longer. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens there, and if that's a tool that some people use in this case. Hey, Denver. Hey, Kyle, going back to the housing supply hike expected to flood the market, is it logical to also predict that interest rates will also trend downwards starting mid to late next year? Yes. The current expectation with most economists is that the Bank of Canada is either done increasing rates or might have 1/4 point increase to go. And then moving into next year, they're expecting that by the midpoint, they'll start to move downwards. We're hearing anywhere from July to October is when they'll start to move downwards. Most of the economists predict the prime rate will be 0.75 to 1% lower by the end of next year. And most economists are also predicting the bond rates to be about 0.75% lower by the end of next year than they are today. So taking a fixed rate, you could expect that fixed rates would be about 0.75% lower than they are today, and the Bank of Canada to be anywhere from 0.75 to 1% lower at the end of next year. So we are starting to see some clients are thinking maybe a variable rate is the right way to go given that information. Hey, Andrew, would you think that they'll have to address the need for short-term rentals for many industries like film, et cetera? I mean, I think that they should, and I think that they do need to. Will they? I feel like the government's got their blinders on. They probably considered these things to a certain extent and said, nope, the housing crisis is more important than anything else. We're going to hyper focus on this, and industries like film, et cetera, will just figure it out. But that's another one that I didn't put on the list as far as one of the cons. It's not just tourism; it's people that travel up here and stay here for periods of time. I would say that film, it's a bit more likely that people will be staying in a place for 3 months or longer, and so maybe it won't affect film as much. But I know there are certain cases, and I'm sure that there's some people that are in film that would be able to better discuss this than myself. But I'm wondering in film if people are here for at least 3 months in many cases for a shoot. Whereas I don't know if there's a lot of people that are coming up here for just 1 month or shorter terms. James is asking an example of the gray area. The Janyon in Victoria was built as a hotel over 100 years ago, and they renovated it to be micro lofts. They are caught in the crosshairs of this as well. Yeah, I know. It's a very interesting thought that it was built 100 years ago as a hotel, and now it's a residential property. And I know that that's the argument I think that a lot of people will be trying to make for sure, is like, hey, it used to be a hotel, so why can't we be called a hotel again? Reiner, hey Reiner, are you aware of any cities that have redefined short-term rental as 90 days? This is untrue and therefore wrong. So I don't know any cities that have redefined it, but the province has changed the definition for sure. And they're saying that a short-term rental is less than 90 days. So I feel like one of the keys that my understanding anyways is that the province is saying, municipalities, get out of the way. We're gonna just run this, and here are the definitions. And if you go to the site that I posted earlier, the definition of short term is less than 90 days. Hey, Sandra. So I've been hearing that there's no way to get a short-term tenancy underneath the Landlords Tenants Act. Once a tenant is in notice, they must must be given, or once a tenant is in, notice must be given, and only for the reason of the owner or a family member moving in. Can no longer set an end date for tenancy. Yes, that's correct. As it automatically goes into month to month, and then a family member has to move in, and then they get a free month's rent. Absolutely, and I think that's one of the challenges is owners in British Columbia are saying, well, now you're telling me that I have to put a long-term tenant in my property, and it's very, very difficult to get rid of long-term tenants in this province. And so there's a bit of an aversion to putting long-term tenants in there when there's so many restrictions on what owners of their own property can do with their own property. Once you put a tenant in there, it's almost impossible to get them out. Daniel, corporations rent out properties from landlords. Then these corporations rent them out to their workers who are there for a week to a month at a time or so. Someone mentioned to me that this will be no longer allowed with the new regulations. Is there any clarification in the government's documents that touches on this? I've not been able to find anything. Well, my feeling is if the corporation is entering into a long-term tenancy agreement and then subleasing it themselves, or maybe they don't even sublease it, but maybe they just pay, that doesn't seem like it's a short-term rental to me. That seems like it's not. Because the corporation is the one that's entering the agreement with the owner of the property. So interesting to see. I'm not sure exactly what the government's issue with that would be, but I mean, who knows? But I do feel like if the corporation is entering into a long-term tenancy agreement, and then they may decide to sublease it out to individuals or have their workers work in it, I have to imagine that that should work, but who knows? Oh, thanks for the clarification, Reiner. Yeah. Monica, any input from Airbnb? Have they responded to this change? Are they taking any actions? I mean, I've seen some correspondence from Airbnb, but there's not a lot there. I think that they need to kind of wrap their heads around it, and it's really important for Airbnb to get this right. And so I don't think that rushing into it and saying, oh, we're going to do this and this and this. They're obviously encouraging people to say, hey, fill in this petition. Let's push back. But there's, I think it's going to take some time before Airbnb comes out with an official feeling on how to deal with this. Karen, so we are in a regional district, an electoral district that does not currently issue business licenses for short-term rentals. Will they be required to do so, or can they opt out? We're currently zoned commercial tourism. My feeling is, number one, that the new provincial rules would say, well, you should be having to issue. You should be having to get a business license, and now the city or the province would be the one that's dealing with it. However, if the population is under 10,000 and it's not, you're not on the list, then the city would have the choice to decide to let the province handle it, or they could opt out. And so I think it depends on whether the city is going to opt in or out, or the regional district. Also, if you're zoned commercial tourism, that might be different. I think that zoning may also be a different method, because it's not, if it's commercial tourism, then it's not residential. And I think the purpose of this is to get non-conforming residential units back onto the marketplace for long-term tenancies. So Karen, you might be good there. Hard to say. Again, there's so many moving parts, but I think you might be okay. Alejandro says, I believe you're still allowed to have a fixed term tenancy end date only if Section 13(1) applies. Yeah. Alejandro is the property manager, by the way. If you need a property manager, reach out to Alejandro and he can probably give you some advice and input because he knows these rules better than I do. That's for sure. You live and breathe these release agreements. We have an anonymous question here. So I already got one booking for next September. I'm still debating if I should reach out to the guest to cancel or still wait for a few months to see more details from the regulations. Cancel a booking also as a penalty. Well, I guess my feeling is that there might still be some dust settling here in the next little while. I'd probably give it a little bit of time and wait it out and see if any of these changes do come up. And I guess my feeling is if there is a penalty to canceling this, well, if you can't operate as a short-term rental anyways, then what's the big deal about having a penalty, I suppose? So, it is what it is. Government regulations come out, and unfortunately, this will affect a lot of people. You may have to cancel it, but I would probably, if I were you, I'd probably just give it a little bit of time. There might be an extension period here. The government might say, hey, you know what? We get it. It's not really fair and reasonable for us to tell everybody that you have to do this, and now everybody has to sell at a loss, etc. Maybe they just extend it so that the amount of people that are going to liquidate their properties happens over a smoother curve, and so there's less of a financial downside to these individuals. So I would give it some time because these rules could be amended, probably not in a major way, but could be in a minor way, such as the time frame. And another question, in a municipality like Maple Ridge, short-term rentals are not allowed. There are around 200 Airbnbs or more currently. Are they all going to lose their income from this? Getting business licenses from short-term rentals may not be feasible. Good point. Again, I don't know in what case or what manner here. If the municipalities are going to say, okay, provincial government, we're going to follow your rules, all of them, the good and the bad, or if the cities are going to say, well, fine, but we actually don't want any Airbnbs here at all. So I think that's still to be determined. I think we still have to see what the result will be. Hard to say. I think it's probably the biggest issue and the biggest thing we don't understand right now is just which one is going to supersede each other. Do the municipal cities still have the ability to decide if they want to cherry pick and say, well, we want these rules, but we don't want these ones, or with the provincial legislation change everything and just say, well, those that didn't do it before will now do it, but only if it's the principal residence. It's really hard to see exactly how they would do that. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, and I'm starting to lose my voice. I've been going off probably all week about the short-term rental stuff, so it's been a long time. But it's good to see a lot of familiar faces. Thanks so much for coming out, guys. The fight is not over. There's still a lot more to go, a lot more to learn. Join the communities. Let's learn and grow together. Figure out how we can address this and move forward. Thanks very much for coming out, and don't forget that we do have a webinar the first Wednesday of every month, and so we'll make sure to let everybody know when the next one is. Okay. And we will be sending out a recording of this out to everybody that registered. And we will also be posting this to YouTube likely by tomorrow. So you'll be able to search us up on YouTube on our YouTube channel at Green Mortgage YouTube. And then everybody that registered will be able to receive a link to that as well. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.